All right, I'm going to go ahead and get us started. Thanks for enjoying the music as much as I do. I know it's a little early, but hopefully it's lifting your spirits just like mine. Welcome, everyone. My name is Andrea Getches. I'm an associate partner with Education Elements, and I also focus my work on developing and updating our approach to strategy and strategic planning, which is what we'll be talking about today. So excited to have you all here today. Hopefully you are fans of EE, you know us already, but for those of you who haven't met us before, we're an education consultancy based all over the country where we work with over 2,000 districts, or impacting over 2,000 students, 300 districts, and just really excited to be sharing what we've been learning through our experience over the past 12 years. So just a little bit about today, since this is a webinar format and you all are not on screen, would just love to encourage you all to add questions to the chat, continue to share where you're calling in from, or if you have any thoughts or if anything resonates with you. Our objectives for today are twofold. First is understanding why and how strategic plan initiatives fail. And the second is exploring the strategies to ensure that yours are a success. So through that, we'll be sharing a few different stories about what organizations we've worked with have tried, what's been tested and true, and what some questions that we're continuing to explore. So you might have joined this call because you have led or been a part of either a strategic plan or an initiative that has been challenging in the past. So this might resonate with you. According to research by Cotter in 2007, we learned that a startling 70% of business initiatives fail. That's 7 out of 10 things that we set out to do, whether in education or in corporations, fail. So we have a lot of plans. And as you all can imagine, if you've ever been involved in a strategic planning process, you invest a lot of time, money, passion into all of that work. And we don't have to look very far to see how what it looks like when initiatives fail. So here are just a few headlines that might be familiar to you, but it costs us in a lot of different ways, in stress, in anxiety, but also financially and in our staffing, which is definitely something that I'm hearing across the country continues to be a challenge. So we're continuing to think about why this happens. Why do our initiatives fail, or why do we struggle to follow through on those ambitious goals that we set out to do? Again, feel free to add into the chat what you think, but there are a few pitfalls that I've seen in the work that I've done that have, rung true as I've worked with a few different partners across the country. So common pitfalls in initiative planning or strategic planning are the following. The first is misaligned initiatives and vision. So sometimes we're setting out to do a lot of different things. In the headline before, there was a school district that had spent millions of dollars on a tech initiative and had not necessarily aligned the devices to the content that needed to be taught, or the approach that the district was taking. Those misaligned initiatives are very likely to fail when we think about how we make sure that what we set out to do organizationally is also what we do on the day-to-day on those initiatives, strategies that we take on. The next is failing to build buy-in. At Education Elements, I'm going to talk a little bit about this, but just touching on it is our approach of the process and not just the plan. We believe that the process of strategic planning should build buy-in in your community. And so when it's time to roll out an initiative, it doesn't feel like something completely new and completely different. So failing to build that buy-in can be a challenge. It's an uphill battle to build the credibility, the momentum around initiatives. The last is doing too much at once. I think almost all organizations are guilty of this, but in particular in education, the stakes are so high that saying no to an initiative that we know could be impactful feels riskier than taking on too much. So today we're going to talk about ways in which you can be strategic, or you can make some difficult choices to narrow your focus and make sure that you're doing the just right thing at the just right time. So I've alluded to this, but what is the alternative? If we know that we're fighting these steep odds, it's very difficult for us to anticipate a new way or a different way of doing this. And feel free to share in the chat anything that's come up for you. If there are any other pitfalls that you think have led to your initiatives failing, I would love to address those. Also, I wanted to say that I will leave some time at the end for Q&A to make sure that we can answer your questions and collaborate as well. So yeah, let's talk a bit about the alternative. What does this look like? And so I'm adding some of my favorite quotes here, some reading that I highly encourage you to do if strategy is something that you're interested in. But I'll read these to you and kind of share the two perspectives that I like here. So the first is by Mike Porter, author of Competitive Strategy. Strategy requires making explicit choices to do some things and not others, and building a business around those choices. In short, strategy is choice. More specifically, strategy is an integrated set of choices. And then Roger Martin, who leads strategy for IDEO and is author of the book How to Win, says, the objective is not to eliminate risk, but to increase the odds of success. So when you put these together, it sounds a lot more about how I set up my March Madness bracket and think about making choices between things. I can't choose them all, but my choices should make sense. And what I like about Roger Martin's quote is thinking about how we can't ensure perfection, we can't ensure success, but we can increase the odds that we will succeed. By aligning our strategy, making those choices make sense for our community. So I'll share a little bit more about education elements and what we believe about strategy in general. And I think that a lot of this helps when initiatives, I want to talk a bit about how to create initiatives in a way that is responsive and builds from your community, and then also on the follow through. So what we believe when we think about strategic planning is, first, we have to have many perspectives, and they're not just consulted, they're also included, because we want to make sure that the plan is developed with and for the community. The next piece is engaging our stakeholders, not just in giving us one-way feedback, but also in designing the solutions. That way we ensure high buy-in and low friction. The next piece is planning for short sprints and making sure that we have the space to pivot and ensure that our teams are responsive. So in practicing throughout the process that we plan for short periods of time and that we make space for change, we build the muscle in our teams to be able to do that once we're carrying out those initiatives. And the last is communication, making sure that it's both clear and constant, because we want our stakeholders, we want our community to integrate the beliefs. So that challenge of aligning our initiatives to our vision or our purpose, we want to make sure that that rings true and that we're integrating these beliefs and making sure that folks see themselves in our initiatives and our plan. So just an overview here. If you've worked with us in strategic planning, you know that we're not about just building a plan just because. For us, it's very important that you understand the different components of a plan and why you incorporate them. So what purpose does this component of a strategic plan serve for you and your community? So you can see on the far left, we have the titles or the names of what it could be. On the far right, there's some alternatives of what other folks have used or what we've seen across the country. And in the middle, you can see the purpose. So I want to talk a bit about the strategies, the bottom two rows there. So strategies, also initiatives, or can be used or called initiatives or actions. This is how we get to success. It's the very tactical items that help us achieve our mission, our vision, our values. And those series of decisions that we were talking about before really ring true or come out through our priorities. What are the big buckets of things we want to do? And then again, the strategies or initiatives are those things that are tactical that help us reach our goals. So we're going to be focusing in on that, our strategies or our initiatives. A bit about our approach, because I think a lot of this has, I think is a good context for you all to know how we get to really strong initiatives, how that is just as important as how you follow through. So just a quick overview on education elements approach. We believe in starting off with really strong stakeholder engagement. So how do you know what you want to know, from whom you need that information, and what is the best strategy to get it? So we work with folks to think about how do we look beyond a survey and think about different ways to gain insight from our stakeholders. In foundations, we work on getting that stakeholder feedback and creating themes. So what are our priority areas, but then also what makes us unique and different as a community? What's our mission? What's our vision? What are our belief statements or guiding values? Then in design, in those buckets, we start thinking about the solutions. So again, this is where the initiatives come in. What are the things that we're going to take on in order to achieve those big buckets of priorities? And then finally, we create the plan that then goes back out. So as you can imagine, in both plan and align and design, we incorporate stakeholder feedback and their design in creating these initiatives to make sure that they're not just for, but with our community. So as you can see, this approach can lead to folks really identifying with the initiatives that they've helped co-create. So I want to talk a little bit about how we get there. What does it look like to go from an idea to an initiative? So I shared this belief before. Stakeholders are engaged in the feedback and in the design. And what I like about this visual is it literally shows you how we have a conversation, we engage folks, they generate ideas that look like these Post-its in the middle. And then from those ideas, they gain inspiration. What are the top 2 or 3 things that we want to build out more? And then when you have this beautiful final plan, you've gone from a conversation to a Post-it to those solid initiatives that we're hoping to take on. So again, this is how you get to your plan, but now what? If we know we're fighting against those odds that 7 out of 10 initiatives fail, how do we make sure that your initiative is not one of those? So a few tips that we've learned as we've supported districts and communities and following through on their initiatives. The first is reflecting on the depth of the initiative. So we like this approach by Chris Deed. I'm not going to go into too much detail here, but I'll leave it up so that you can read that when you are spreading an initiative, there are different phases of your initiative. So the first is when you go in depth, you're thinking about building the base from which you want others to use as an example as they move forward. So a lot of this starts out in our communities like pilots. We work very deeply to develop an approach that we're really proud of. And then we move into the second step. We're sustaining, we're maintaining the changes, we're developing a system for other folks to incorporate this so that then we can move into the third phase, which is spreading. How do we diffuse the innovation, make sure more people can use it, and ensure that it's effective by utilizing less resources? So how do we go from that one deep idea that we were really following through on all of the different pieces to now having a guide or support for others to take that on? The next is shifting. How do we go from that original innovation to moving beyond what the original perfect evolution of it was, and shifting it to adapt to different contexts? So if I were to build this out as an initiative more specifically, I've seen districts talk about a reading program where they first test it in one school, make sure that it's really strong. And then when they move into sustain, they start to share that information, make sure that it stays pretty true to the original version. Once we start spreading it, we're allowing other people to learn from what we've learned. We have some reflections, we have some tweaks, and then we hope that they can shift it. How do I adapt it for my students versus your students? And then the final phase is revising the innovation. How do we go from the first thing that we tried to evolving it to the new times? So this is obviously more of an academic way of thinking about how initiatives can evolve. what does this look like in practice? So this is an example of a timeline that a district used when they were thinking about their initiatives. So actually they had a lot of initiatives here on the far left. So this column over here shows a lot of different initiatives that they wanted to take on. And what they did was they grouped them. So they didn't exactly use these 5 steps, but they used 3. And then that's on the far right. Implementing means that they're doing it already and they're just building it out a little bit more. The next is a transition period. That might be when they were thinking about pilots or trying something new. And then the third is research and discovery. So this is before they even wanted to try something or announce it to their community. This is when they're looking into vendors, options, how other people have done it. So by classifying their different initiatives, they were able to prepare their community and their staff to say, hey, we're taking a lot on, but we're not taking it all on right away and not to the same extent for all of our initiatives. Because sometimes what happens is when we have too many things, people think that we have to do them all exactly perfectly. But when you give permission to learn, to discover, to do research, it actually gives folks a bit more ownership as well, because they know that the idea is not completely built out and there's still room for some input. So I like this example. I'm going to show it again later for how it evolves when you think about those pivots that we talked about earlier. Thanks, Cynthia. Yes, I appreciate the different ways that you think about those initiatives as well as putting them into implementation. I think makes it a lot more practical for folks to understand, what's coming first, then next and last. The next piece is identifying your impact players. This is a concept that I really love and have borrowed from the author Liz Wiseman. If you haven't read this book already, highly recommend it. But Liz Wiseman talks about identifying those people who don't just do their job, but do the job that needs to get done. And I absolutely love that concept. These are the folks that, you implicitly, explicitly trust to handle complex, ambiguous problems. Some of the characteristics of impact players are they're excited about messy problems. They step in to create solutions, or they anticipate a problem and solve for it. They ask questions, they adjust their approach. They make work feel lighter for others. And you'll note that what I typically would have said before reading this book was, who are your leaders? Who are the people that rise as leaders? But it's not just that. It really is about folks who are contributing in a different way. So they're not just, again, seeing the literal task that they need to do, but they're taking the spirit of that task and building beyond. And these are some identifiers for impact players, but you should be looking out for your impact players throughout your strategy process. So how does this relate to what we do at Education Elements? We talked a bit about creating a responsive approach to strategic planning. So we incorporate our stakeholders throughout the process, but we also think it is equally as important for you to incorporate your stakeholders in an intentional way throughout your planning. So here are a few examples. We talk about creating a feedback loop in our approach. And as you can see here, we have different layers. I like to think of these different teams as different components or pieces of the pie in decision making. So I'll share a bit about our approach, but then also how you can identify your impact players through that. The first is, I'm actually going to start up here with the steering team. Those are the folks that you would traditionally know as the strategic planning committee. They're 10 to 15 people who are the decision makers. The challenge with that is that we want that group to be incredibly representative, to have folks of all different levels of tenure, different types of roles, different departments. And as you can imagine, getting that many people or that much representation in just 15 people is challenging. So we've incorporated other opportunities for folks who care just as deeply about the strategy of your organization to get involved. And that looks like planning teams. Those are folks who, one example that I like to share is kind of like the curriculum and instruction team. highly important to the success of our districts or school education organizations, but often overrepresented in some of the teams that we work on. So if we were having 1 to 2 representatives on the steering team, we would want to make sure that as many folks who are invested and need to know this information or need to be part of decision making are incorporated in the planning teams. So we're bringing folks in to consult, to check decisions, or to see different options, to provide input before we make a final decision in the steering team. The last is also having advisors. So having folks who have a specific interest or expertise that don't necessarily need to be involved in the entire process, but can provide insight on some key decisions. So another example of this that I like to share is I was working with a district on the East Coast, and they were considering changing their start and stop times. And they were pretty convinced that they wanted to adapt them, but they also brought in their chief of police to provide some insight. When they came in, they said, I understand your interest in wanting to do this, but part of the challenge is that this main road is our only way for commuting in this community. So if you change this, it's going to have a huge impact on our traffic patterns. Can we consider this or the other thing? This person also came to light as an impact player, somebody who they knew that they could leverage within their community to think about creative ways to solve the challenge. So back to impact players, I think that was one example of an advisor turning into one, but having impact players throughout the process, I think, is incredibly exciting too. As you design new initiatives, you think of new solutions and ideas, you're going to notice excitement from people. The folks who just come with an initiative and then, in between meetings, they thought about something else, or they solved a way to fund it. Keep your eye out for those people, because those are the folks that are going to be contributing to the overall vision of your approach in a really meaningful way. They're probably also key to building in the buy-in from others. The next piece is developing a theory of action. Excuse me. So this is something that I think folks play around with a lot. So as we shift from, we've identified those key initiatives, we have our core people of who we want to get invested, they're all aligned to what we're doing, but how do we make sure that we're keeping tabs of what happens as a result of the decisions that we make? So a theory of action is a logical chain of reasoning that explains both what are the practices that we're going to take on, what are the results that we hope it produces, and then what outcomes or what is the impact that that's going to have. So you can see a few examples here. So initiatives from our strategic plan that will produce results in changing in adult behaviors or student behaviors, or our structures will shift. And our outcomes will be that, there's an impact for our students, our staff, or our community. So we think about building a theory of action to drive those outcomes. So not only are you saying, if I do this, then this other thing will happen, you're also developing a way to measure if they're attributable to the program. So how are we making sure that because or as a result of an action, we're going to see that outcome? So we think about fidelity, effectiveness, and impact. To the extent to which the initiatives are going to change or make a change or be intended as or implemented as planned. So kind of this mirrors that idea of a depth of a approach. So how do we know that we're being faithful to that idea? The effectiveness is the extent to which the intended or the activity or the initiative is producing the desired results. And then again, the impact to which in the long term or sustained changes occur for a target population. So again, this is a lot of theory, and I think I'm not a researcher, but a theory of action really resonates with me. So I like to look at it in a more simplified approach. So this is an example of an initiative that was built out to talk a little bit more about the impacts. And yes, Mimi, I saw your question. We will definitely make this available to you afterwards. So if you can see here, and you could totally feel free to recreate this with your own initiative. But on the far left, we have a belief, right? That we believe that strong instructional practices will allow teachers to support students with their individual needs. This theory of action is related to an initiative addressing learning loss. So as this is a term that's been thrown around a lot in the throes of the pandemic, but really in the last few months, as we're thinking about addressing the needs that students have or as a result of the uncertainty over the past few years. So in this district, they were thinking about how can we address the needs of students while also honoring the fact that we're having some real challenges with staffing. So their theory of action was, we believe that if we train instructional coaches in strong coaching models and strategies, that they will be better able to support teachers in addressing learning loss. So by investing in coaches, we hope that that will impact teachers' ability to learn quickly and adapt to the needs of their students. So that's our belief. That's the, we're thinking about the fidelity and the intended impact. What we built out next was, what are those actions? What is the effectiveness is kind of the middle column here. So what will happen for coaches? Coaches will get professional development. They'll get, some certain competencies that they'll learn about. They'll learn about coaching models. For teachers, they're developing their own coaching portfolio. They're going to be coached. They're going to be getting some specific strategies that will help them in their instructional practices. And then finally, students will have, they will be observed, they'll be interviewed. They're going to, in essence, get a new instructional experience as a result. So those are the different actions that we're taking aligned and that are attributable to our theory of action. On the far right, we're aligning our metrics. So what are we thinking about the ways we will see and measure success? So coaches will feel empowered to adapt to their teachers' needs. They will report confidence in this. Coaches will lead 100% of coaching cycles with all of their teachers. Teachers will receive that coaching support. They will report that they feel supported, and their students ultimately will achieve academically, but they'll also have a feeling of being respected and honored in school. So those are all the things that we're committing to, and those are the things that we want to measure. How you want to get there is definitely something you want to talk about with your team. But we want to make sure that whatever we're intending to set out and do, we're following up and we're making sure that we're measuring that. So I said I wanted to talk a bit about those initiatives that I shared earlier. What I love about this was when they did a bit of a reflection and they thought about, how are we doing? What's the progress that we're making? They were able to provide updates on their different initiatives. So they came up with this key on the far right that shows, we're making progress aligned to our theory of action. We're pivoting. We're actually making a shift because we found a different need. Something is on pause, as you can see right here. This was April, May of 2020. So there were a few things that had to be paused as a result of the pandemic. And then there were a few things that they realized these no longer make sense because of the time that we're in, or because we just need to delay it a bit given our, new information or current events. So it can be as simple as sharing these updates with your community. It could also just be it could be more complex, more in-depth, thinking about the metrics of success that you have aligned to your initiatives. But it's important that you feel that follow through to make sure that folks are seeing the progress that you're making and that they're seeing that the actions that you're taking are as a result of a goal that you've set out to do as a community. All right, this leads us to the next piece around remaining open to feedback and pivots. And, we've gotten through this pretty quickly, so we'll have some good time for Q&A, but thinking about remaining open to feedback and pivots, I think also relates to this last slide. As you can see, there are some moments where, device incentive that actually had to pivot to go a lot faster at the beginning of the pandemic, or counseling and student supports, like that might have been something they were just researching or they weren't planning to do in depth. But they had to do it a lot faster because they knew that that was a need immediately for students. So how do we remain open to feedback and pivots? The first is re-engaging your community. So we talked a bit about this at the beginning. At Education Elements, we believe in our process that it's about high quality stakeholder engagement, understanding the needs of your community through multiple tactics. We believe that things like surveys are excellent tools to get us a wide voice and broad impact of the feelings or the sentiments of your organization or your community. But there are also other ways that you can reach out to folks. So these are a lot of the strategies that we use in our initial engagement, but we encourage folks to re-engage the community. How do you use the tactics that really worked for you to gain insight into how they see progress? Is it working for them? Is it what they asked for? So I'll share a little bit of the tactics here, and we'll share this guide in the follow-up as well. We have an include guide for strategies for including your stakeholders. But targeted survey, bulletin boards, those are the things that give you a wide audience approach. Then there's empathy building, things like doing a community walk or shadowing a student, family, or staff member to get a better understanding of what their day-to-day experience is like. This is great to do, at the beginning of your planning and then as a follow-up, but it's also great if you haven't tried it ever and you're trying to experience a new initiative. What is it like for the student or for the stakeholder who's impacted? The next is the town hall. Not only do you model vulnerability, but you have another opportunity to communicate and share your story. The saying of if you don't write your own story, somebody else will write it for you. And we believe that you have to be at the forefront of your story, of the story of your community. So making sure that you create, whether it's a forum or videos or other ways in which you engage your stakeholders, we want to make sure you're modeling vulnerability and sharing the updates within your organization. And then the last piece is building that personal connection by also understanding. So we have two different types of interviews. We have in-depth interviews that are not included here, but those are for specific topics. There's also empathy interviews here, which is about understanding the experience of a user. So what is their experience with an initiative, with an approach? How do you adapt that? What are the things that work for them? What doesn't? And then the last is developing focus groups or having different groups of people based on identity or needs or common interests come together to share their opinions about a certain topic. So how do you re-engage in these strategies to make sure that what worked for you at the beginning is working for you again? Again, the more you do it, just like our procedures and routines in a classroom, the same thing can be true for our communities. How are we making sure that an approach that we use that really works continues to be available to people? The next piece is building in retrospectives. So how do you set increments of time where you reflect back on your project or your initiative and you make space for that reflection? The big things, there are a lot of different strategies out there, protocols that you can use for retrospectives, but the purpose of a retrospective is to think about these three questions. What should we continue to do? What should we stop doing? And what do we need to start doing? So all of this information helps you decide, how do we need to adjust our approach, or how do we need to stay consistent in our approach to make sure that we get those desired outcomes that we set out for in the theory of action. Why do we do retrospectives? We believe a lot in the power of psychological safety. The ability to communicate failure or mistakes actually makes us stronger teams in our ability to connect with one another and understand where we can get ahead of some of those challenges. When can we address something at the beginning of it becoming an issue? So I like this article in the New York Times that talking about failure is crucial for growth. And they give some great tips on how to make sure you do that in a good way or in a productive way. So some tips here: frame things as a question or a hypothesis. It changes the tone from what did we do wrong to how might we increase the success of something, or how might we ensure blank. Discussion prevents replication. So if we make a mistake once, or if things aren't working very well and we're not talking about it, we might just double down and continue to do it. So we want to make sure that we're stepping in and seeing where we can adjust before the problem becomes bigger. The next is by talking about it and making it more of a practice within your organization or your community, it reduces the complexity. It reduces your ability to blame other folks and makes it about us solving a problem together. So highly encourage you to just Google retrospectives. There are lots of protocols out there for the best ways to guide those reflections with your teams. And these honest conversations will really lead you to assess, are my initiatives doing what I intended them to do? And I think that's a big piece here is just because we committed to something doesn't mean that we shouldn't shift it if the data is telling us that it's not doing what we say it's going to do. So fidelity to a plan is not the same as being faithful to an outcome or an impact that we want to have in our community. So we went through a lot of information pretty quickly, but I wanted to make sure we had plenty of time for some questions. We talked a bit about the challenges related to strategic plans and how we follow through on our initiatives. We also explored some strategies for ensuring the success of your initiatives. So I'd love to pause here and give you a moment. I'll play some music. You can add to the chat or add to the Q&A option. What are the different questions that you have? This is a lot of information. So take a moment, add your reflections, and we'll come back in about half a song. Please continue to add your questions. I have a few. The first is from Cynthia. This is such a great question. So how do you help your team create a shared definition of an initiative? The list can be so long and the process is critical. This is absolutely true. I can tell you a bit about how we do it at Education Elements. So a few general tips, because obviously it's a bit complex if you think about the different ways in which you have to align your team. So it is a series of conversations and a lot of, push and pull and understanding where we're coming from. But I would say there's probably 3 tips. The first is aligning on language. So when we talk about what an initiative could be or what they have been in the past, we think about what grain size is it? When we're thinking about strategic planning, something that we think about is something that the district has to have a say in. So something that you can just do in one department or one person can do without needing the approval or permission of a district is probably not an initiative. So getting super clear on what an initiative is or is not is probably the first piece. The second is the grain size. So how large is it going to be? What is the impact of that initiative? Is, obviously understanding the infrastructure that you have to either create new roles or if let's say you want to create a community center, and that obviously has very different implications if you have an empty building in your organization versus if you have to build something new. So understanding the parameters and the grain size for which you want your initiatives to be, I think has a lot to do with your leadership or the folks that are in the room. And then the last piece related to initiatives is you have to have a conversation about the initiatives related to one another. So we do a prioritization process where we think about the ease of implementation. So how difficult or easy is it based off of, a series of questions that we ask you related to cost, resources. Is it something completely new? Is it an iteration on what you already do? And then what is the impact? Does it have a broad impact for a lot of different people, or does it have a really targeted impact that is highly impactful for a subset of individuals, students, families? And how do we compare those, and how do we make choices between initiatives? So I don't know if anybody watches the Magic of Tidying Up or with Marie Kondo, where she puts all of the clothes in one place and then says, does this bring me joy? You kind of have to do that type of reckoning conversation with your team too, where you say, these are all of the different ideas that we have, and what is realistic for us to take on. So again, this is where I think strategy is complex, and why folks usually call us in is because they want a facilitator to kind of get through the muck of those conversations. It can feel really challenging, but it's one of those group projects that when you do it with a team, it feels like you've really accomplished something together once you've worked through it. But I love that question. Thank you, Cynthia. Grace, yeah, I wanted to know if you'll get the slides. Yes, we'll have a follow-up email and you'll get the slides. Okay, love this. Another one. And this is different, Cynthia. I'm from a curriculum team and implementing a new math curriculum this current year. Next year, we will focus a lot on implementation with fidelity. So this might represent more work for the academic deans. Okay, so yeah, I hear what you're saying here. So you're having a new math curriculum. You want to do it pretty in depth. You want to make sure that you're staying, you're ensuring the fidelity of the initiative before you spread it. So something I would encourage you, I know this isn't really a question, but what I like about this is thinking about documenting what is the thing that you hope to change and what are the different changes or impact that you see throughout this process. That'll help you recreate that impact. So when it comes time to pivot or expand your initiative, you're thinking about what's the impact that we want and are there different ways for us to achieve it? Because when you go to a new school or you go to a new community, you might still want that same impact, but you might need different strategies or different ways to get there. So something I would encourage you to do. Oh, okay. I see your, how do I get buy-in? So the first thing I was saying is, how do I ensure the impact of it? And then how do you ensure buy-in? I think you've got to do a lot of storytelling around your initiative. Why are we taking this on? What is the challenge? I imagine that there's something related to either math achievement in your district or there's a need in the community. Maybe there's a request from families that there's more of a robust system. I think connecting the feedback that you've received to the initiative that you're taking on can help folks see the connection. You've requested this, or students need this. As a result, we're trying this. This is the impact that we hope to see. These are the ways in which you can provide feedback. So I think creating that feedback loop, even if you haven't done it in the generation of the initiative, it's sharing, this is the intended impact, and this is where we hope to gain your reflections, or this is where we hope to run a retrospective and see how successful are we being with this initiative. And let them know this is when you can provide impact or input on the impact of this initiative. So make sure that folks see it along the way. Love that. Jennifer is wondering how you focus on strategic initiatives, new things, and the existing ongoing work that we're maintaining. Yes, love that question, Jennifer. I encourage people to include those initiatives as well as they're prioritizing. So if there are things that we're doing really well that we want to make sure we're maintaining, that should fall within that grid when you're assessing whether it has a broad or targeted impact, whether it's easy or hard. Hopefully it's easier because you've been doing it and now it's just a matter of sustaining it. So naming that for your community and saying, this is the result of this huge investment that we've made in an initiative, and this is why we want to keep doing it. Or this is why we know we need to keep doing it because it's generating results beyond what we even considered possible. We want to make sure that we're maintaining that. But I think you also need to remain open to getting some feedback here. So we know that this is strong. We want to continue doing it. What are your thoughts? Do you have any feedback on ways that we can tweak our approach? And then on the other hand, when you have folks who want to create new initiatives, you have to have a realistic conversation about, are these new initiatives going to take away from things that we're already doing really well? Or does the initiative that is working already or is sustaining, does it require the same number of people that it has as it did in its inception? Can some of those resources now be moved, or can we postpone something for, after this big implementation? So having some very realistic conversations about what do we want to take on, especially if we've already taken on a lot new. Another thing I'll say about that is in the strategic planning process, the mission and vision conversation will probably illuminate those things that are going really well. So folks will want to stay true to those things too. So again, that kind of speaks to the other question about the grain size of your initiatives. If you already have something that you're taking on, you want to have a conversation with folks about when to take on new. One more comment I'll make about that is also The time to have that conversation is when people have already generated their ideas. We're thinking about comparison. It's not when people are in the process of generating ideas. We don't want to limit brainstorming by saying, hey, we're not going to be able to do some things because we're already doing this other thing. We want to have that conversation in a more realistic way when we're kind of comparing initiative to initiative. Ian, is there a threshold of leader bandwidth that you find necessary for initiatives to be successful? Time, support, resource autonomy. I would say there's not one specific bandwidth, but the biggest thing is that everybody needs to be aligned on what that is. What I've seen most successful is having very clear, like identifying those impact players and putting them in positions of leading those initiatives and taking on projects that they're really excited about, and that you always have somebody on those teams who was a part of the initial ideation around an initiative. So when it's time to make shifts or pivot within a project or initiative, that folks understand why it was chosen in the first place, what the intent of it was, and then if it's not quite meeting that intent, why we would want to shift. I think that in an ideal world, a one-to-one, like one steering team member, somebody who was a part of the design of your strategic plan, would be a part of your leading your initiatives. I've seen some people have departments take on initiatives, and the leadership goes, is a bit more flat. There are a lot more people involved, and I've seen success in different ways. I think it's really a matter of your community and your context and how folks work together. So thinking about how much can people take on, how much can the superintendent or the leader of the organization stay informed. It needs to be, something realistic for your team. Follow-up question from Jennifer. So how do you measure progress and outcomes? Other times a strategic plan is developed and then people start the work, but how does it become a living process or document that continues with eyes on it? I love that question. So the first piece is those retrospectives. So if you have those within your initiatives, that's great. It's also more important if you have multiple initiatives or it's coming as a result of a strategic plan, that you have maybe quarterly or semester, like every half of the year, you're doing a reflection on all of your initiatives. Where do all of them stand? What's the progress that we've made? What can we learn from each other's initiatives? Where can we collaborate? There's been one example that I love was there was a district I was working with where they had both a personalized learning initiative, so thinking about impacting instruction for their students, and they had a device initiative. How do we make sure that we get devices in the hands of students? What they realized was that by both of these initiatives working separately, they were kind of like waiting for the other to make a decision. So what devices are we going to have? Therefore, what curriculum do we want to purchase? And the device folks were like, well, what curriculum do you need? Therefore, what device should we purchase? And what they realized was they actually needed to come together. So I think as the work becomes more organic, you start realizing, hey, there's another group that's naturally a collaborator for us. Maybe we should be merging these initiatives. Maybe they're more related than we thought. So I think building in a cadence or a structure for folks to reflect and work together is probably key. So just a habit of reflection. And I think a key to that is also comfort with transparency. So if we're having conversations where we're saying, hey, this initiative, we're actually going to sunset it. It's not really gaining the traction that we hoped it would, or it's not having the impact that we hoped it would. It's time for us to, invest our energy elsewhere. Those are tough conversations to have that I think folks aren't as comfortable having. So I think that building the space for it makes it feel safer, and it will save you a ton of time in the long run. So people are just not following through on things just because they said they were going to do it. So yeah, I would say the biggest tip there is creating those regular points for reflection and figuring out a way to monitor the progress that makes most sense to the initiative. These are great questions. Feel free to add more questions, but I wanted to share one more thing. We have a strategic planning mini conference on April 26th, 8 a.m. Pacific, 11 a.m. Eastern. This is if you're through this process have gotten more interested in the process of strategic planning or thinking about maybe bringing on a partner like Education Elements to help you with your strategic plan. This is a great venue to see how we approach it. So this mini conference is both a series of videos that talks a bit about our phases of work and also a discussion. So it is about, I believe, 2 hours long, where you'll watch a video, and then a bit more interactive where you'll talk to other folks around the country around different challenges or questions you have related to strategic planning. And then finally, I'm going to put a link in the chat for our survey, but would love feedback from you all on this webinar in general. If you have any questions, you can add that to the survey as well. Sorry, that's not a hyperlink. Let me see if I can get that for you. But yeah, we love your feedback and would love to interact with you further. If there's something that you're thinking about that you have more questions, please feel free to reach out. Somebody from our team will definitely reach out to you if this is something that you're thinking about, you have more questions. But otherwise, thank you so much for spending your Thursday morning with me. It was so great getting to know you all through the chat and hearing about the different ways that you're thinking about this. So have a great rest of your day. Thanks, everybody.